Hi, hello everyone. We're here today to talk about transitioning to .NET Maui and what we know today about that transition. My name is Mitchell Sellers. I am a Microsoft MVP, ASP Insider, and I run a software development company here in the United States. My contact information is here. I'll put this up again here at the end of the talk as well. Anything and everything technology related. I love sharing my experiences and my information. So if you have questions, something that I don't get addressed today, that you want to get some additional information on, by all means, please do feel free to reach out to me. Pay attention to my Twitter stream and everything else, as I will continually be updating as more information comes out. For those of you that are brand new to the .NET Maui concept and understanding kind of where things are and what's going on, there was a lot of intentions with this talk and the timing of this event, as well as other events, that we would be able to talk about the real thing and what we can do with .NET Maui, how you transition to it, what the future looks like from Xamarin Forms, and moving your applications forward. However, in mid-September, there was a big announcement from the .NET Maui team. And the biggest thing that we got from this conversation was that .NET Maui was being pulled from the general release of .NET 6 and Visual Studio 2022, and will become something that comes at a later time. So, this really changed that landscape a little bit for those that have been following along. .NET Maui being the evolution of what's next, the expectation, from everybody was, hey, when .NET 6 comes out, we're going to be able to go to Maui. Going to Maui means that we move everything forward. It definitely threw a wrench into the works. As we look at the why behind this, I took this snippet out from the official announcement where they announced the delay of the release. And I think the important thing for us to understand is they are holding this release to make sure that it works, that it can actually go to the devices, that you're going to be able to use Maui and deploy your applications, whether it be iOS or Android or Windows, and be assured that it's going to work. The reason I start with this is it kind of changes everything that we talk about today. It changes where you might take your organization. It changes what your next steps are. If you're starting a new project tomorrow, what do you do? If you're starting a new project in a month, what do you do? And we're going to talk about a lot of that today. It's incredibly relevant. It's incredibly important for us to understand where things are going with Maui. It's also important for us to continue testing and validating and working with Maui to make sure that when it does get to the general availability release, that it's there. At this time, the current timeline is they're targeting early Q2 2022 for a release date. There's nothing in terms of, it's April 15th or May 1 or anything like that. It's just loosely set at this point. And we'll continue to kind of talk about this and that progression. But I like to start here because, we're talking about transitioning to .NET Maui, and everything that we're talking about today is absolutely positively subject to change. I'm showing you the information based on what I've been able to experience today, based on what we've been able to validate and test throughout all of the different preview releases that have been coming out with Maui. So with that, right, a little bit more on the transition. They have published documentation that outlines what is going to happen from a transition. So there is a document out on the documentation sites that show this is what we have for transition. This is how you make a transition. And what's really nice is it's a really powerful blurb for us as developers. You don't need to rewrite your Xamarin Forms applications to move them to .NET Maui. However, you need to make a small amount of code changes, and you can use the single project features without merging them into one. That sounds awesome. At the surface, that sounds like exactly what we want from a developer perspective. It makes it so that we can be sure that what we're doing is going to work, that we're going to be able to do things fairly quickly. But then at the very bottom, don't currently migrate your production apps to .NET Maui. So why do we get this disjointed status? Why are they trying to tell us, hey, you're going to be able to do this, but don't do it now? And I think that the real key here is there's multiple reasons behind that overall status. Obviously, the first is the fact that .NET Maui just isn't done yet. As they get closer to being done, my hope is that this transition documentation will improve and that we will get more, we'll get more information, we'll get more ability to go out and actually perform the transitions. The transition steps at a highest level, and I have a little bit more on this as we get a little bit later into the presentation here today, show that you can use a upgrade assistant. One of the things with the upgrade assistant is it's been in the documentation, it's been removed from the documentation, it's currently not in the documentation. The idea is one click, your project changes, and everything moves forward. The problem that I have, or the thing I always tell people to be aware of, is there's this one pesky little requirement that they list in here, which is build and fix any issues. That line, that single statement of fix any issue, is where we typically get caught into those weeds. So we know a little bit, we know some, we can talk about the architecture, but these are the kinds of things that we're going to need to be looking at as we start to expand upon where we go from here. So what do we know? The nice thing is, although Maui is not ready for general availability, although Maui is not ready for your application as a whole to migrate over, we do know that there's a large bit of the process of how Maui works and how Maui applications are going to be structured that you're going to be able to understand the project structure, the solution structure. This information can help us as we start to build our existing applications or even a new application. If we know some of the target and where things are going to go, we can do certain things with our application architectures to hopefully align ourselves a little bit more cleanly to the process of being able to get transitioned to Maui when it comes to be. So the biggest thing that we know that's different for those of us that have used Xamarin Forms today is that the project structure with Maui is a single project by default. So it uses multi-targeting to be able to target and do a build that's going to generate the Android app, a build that's going to generate the iOS app, a build that will generate the Windows app. But it doesn't require the larger separation that we get with the current Xamarin structure. Where this becomes really, really beneficial, and I'll show two project examples here at the end, is that things like resources, images, fonts, app icons, splash screens, raw assets, where today, if you want to include an image on a page within your Xamarin Forms application, you have to take that same image and put a copy of it in your Android app. You have to put a copy of it in your iOS app. And you have to make sure that you keep those in sync. One of the biggest things I see developers do today is sometimes they forget and they don't update in one place. It gets missed in a code review, that kind of thing. And so this will be one of those areas, one of those ways that it's able to help us make things more consistent from a project structure perspective. And that's going to, I believe, reduce the development effort. Anything that's platform specific, we can still do. Most of those at the current time are in separate subfolders that are targeted. Some things are going to require compiler directives. I believe that there's been a push continually to limit the use of compiler directives to accomplish that task, but we will only, we'll have to kind of see what happens with that as things continue on. So what does it look like from a developer perspective? I think it's important to understand at a highest level from a marketing perspective, .NET Maui and Xamarin are different. When we look at what Microsoft says Maui is they outline it as a multi-platform app UI being cross-platform framework for creating native mobile and desktop applications with C# and XAML. Using Maui, you can develop apps that run on Android, iOS, Mac OS, and Windows from a shared code base. If we look at the definition of Xamarin, it is much, much different. And the key here for me is Xamarin extends the .NET developer platform with tools and libraries specifically for building apps for Android, iOS, tvOS, watchOS, macOS, and Windows. The reason why I bring this up is Xamarin has always been a tool set. It's been an add-on. It's been a set of extra things. Maui is treated as a much more consistent, integrated, this is how we build apps that target multiple user interfaces. So I think that we're going to see from a developer experience that they really, really are trying to get your life and the architecture life to be much more consistent and much more user-friendly for all of your developers and to be able to make your life easier at the end of the day. If we look at the high-level architectures and we try to compare a little bit of the Xamarin Forms architecture and project structure to that of what we get with Maui, we start to see some of those pieces where everything ends up working. So as we start to look at the way that things work, right, we have in Xamarin Forms today, we have Android controls, we have Android platform renderers, we have your shared application code. We then get down into entirely separate code bases with .NET APIs, Android bindings, and all of the Android stuff, Android runtime, mono, Linux kernel. As you go into iOS, you can see it's an entirely different set of everything. So we kind of really have two separate silos. Your shared code sits in the middle, and everything eventually works. Your project structures today are fairly common. You have a shared project of sorts, right, that's used by both the Xamarin Android and the Xamarin iOS applications. And then you have your specific ones for each of those. And we'll dive into this a little bit more today. But this is what you get when you do file new project with a Xamarin Forms project. You get a lot of files, a lot of complexity, multiple projects, and you're going to be in that situation where there's definitely more that you need to work on. As we expand from here and start to look at, what do we get if we are working with Maui, you'll see that they show Maui in an entirely different manner. And what they're looking to do here is showcase that everything is together in one overall platform. Sorry about that. The .NET 6 platform, as you can see, fully encompasses .NET Maui. And for me, the way that they choose to build some of these images, the way that they end up structuring the project as a whole kind of helps me understand from a developer perspective, what they are, looking to accomplish. And so from my perspective, I like seeing the fact that they treat it as .NET 6 is Maui. Xamarin has always been that extra little project that's outside. This puts it inside, and is really truly part of everything that you're accomplishing. If we look at the way that everything comes together, this is where we see something that's much different than what we've got with the Xamarin. We still have a bunch of blocks. We still have a bunch of complexity. But the idea behind the Maui architecture is that we don't necessarily work with nearly as many of those layers on our own. If we look at the scenario where our application code lives, what you're really seeing here is your code lives in this very top block, this app code block. You then leverage .NET Maui. .NET Maui then leverages .NET for Android, .NET for iOS, .NET for Mac, and WinUI. Obviously, it has to do that to be able to take care of all of its internal targeting. It then goes down to the .NET 6 BCL, and then the .NET 6 BCL goes and takes care of everything else. And the idea behind all of this is you stay at the very top and you focus on your application code, and Maui ends up doing everything else for you. So Maui ends up taking a lot of that guesswork out of the process and should hopefully simplify your process entirely with regards to how you manage your projects and everything else. So what does that translate to? What does a app look like? In a single project architecture, this is a simplified example, and we'll dive into a deeper example here in a little bit, but this is what you get. You have a platforms folder, which contains all of the platform-specific stuff. So that's where you're going to see things like your iOS configurations and your info lists and that kind of thing. But then you have your font resources, your image resources, all of your views, everything else is in one particular place. This is going to be far, far simpler for everybody. Now, looking at upgrades, I wanted to take a little bit more of a deeper dive into the current upgrade process. So I mentioned that in one place they talk about, hey, we're going to have a utility. In another place they talk about, well, you just need to do a couple of things. The official documentation, which was last updated on the 20th of September, so we are approaching multiple months old information at this point. But the current structure, the current recommendation is you create a new project with the same name as your existing project. You then basically copy all of your files, except for app XAML, into the newly created project. Then you go through and simply do a rename. And at the most basic level, you do a rename of 3 things. So you rename an old namespace, you rename one using and you replace it with 2 usings, you replace another using with a different one. And then from there, you should be able to run your app and it should work. Now, as much as this seems crazy from those of us that have been around the .NET space for a long time, I'm skeptical. I've been skeptical, but I've been testing. It is working. This process is actually this simple in a lot of cases. Not every application is going to be this simple. If you are doing some things and you've done a lot of complex things to maybe work around limitations or other things in Xamarin Forms over the years, if your project has a large number of custom renderers, if your project has a whole bunch of platform-specific code, yours might be a little bit more complicated to bring everything over. But it's definitely something that's not nearly as hard as you think it is. Now, one thing that is important for all developers to understand is with multi-targeting, how does our build work? What does our process look like? And you can see here that if we want to run the app we can run the app by passing in a different moniker. So run with a flag of -F, .NET 6 Android, .NET 6 iOS, .NET 6 Mac Catalyst. And there's also one for UWP. The idea behind all of this is that you have to be able to understand what you're looking to do. As you work to do this, your automation, your builds that you have in GitHub or Azure DevOps or Jenkins or whatever you're using for any of your automated build processes, those are most likely going to have to change because we are not working with different project files. We're working with one build of one project, but different flags. This is something that there's not a lot of documentation on yet. I think it's a great area for those of us in the community that are leveraging Xamarin Forms today that will be going to Maui in the future. I think it's something that is absolutely going to be supported by community documentation, blog posts, and things of that nature because it's something that isn't necessarily as easy to do. Now, why is all of this so important, right? This is a huge change for us as developers, but what kinds of things are we going to be able to do now? What kinds of new features do we get with Xamarin or with Maui that we don't get with Xamarin today? Well, one of the big things that we get, one of the cool new features that's live is this concept of live preview. If you're like me, one of the things that hot reload is great, right? You can run your app in the emulator and you can, get all of that stuff going. But when you're playing with particular layout items, it's always a pain to launch your app, get to the screen, have the emulator open up the XAML, make a couple of changes, hit save. Then you have to wait for the emulator to reset. What we've got playing here is a demo that has been published of Live Preview, which is currently working in the preview releases that are out there. And what this does is it allows you entirely within Visual Studio to be able to actually see what your form is going to look like on a device without having to actually launch the emulator and do all of those additional things. And for me, it's still leveraging the emulator. It's still leveraging the fact that your application is running and using hot reload, but it brings it inside of one window. So you can come in and actually adjust and validate without having to switch between multiple windows. This is one of the big things I think that's there. Hot reload and those kinds of things are also features that we've seen with the other platforms continuing to get better. For those of us that are looking for ways to do best practices and working to get things, working with dependency injection or whatever other processes that we want, they now are going to be starting to use the standard app builder. This is based off of one of the older preview templates. There's been a couple of preview template changes recently. I don't know if they're going to get to the even more simple, app builder setup process that is started. But what you can see here is we have a lot of the standard things for app builder, where if you're using dependency injection from the Microsoft dependency injection libraries, you can do all of your configuration right in this process. What this means for us as developers is as we start to look at things that we're doing in Xamarin Forms today, we can take some of these concepts and potentially start implementing them. For example, in all of my projects that we build with Xamarin Forms today, we utilize the Microsoft dependency injection process to do all of our view model bindings and service injections and those kinds of things, because I know that we're going to have even better support for it today. We have to jiggle the handle a little bit to get it working in Xamarin Forms, but if I get it working in Xamarin Forms and then it becomes a first-class citizen as part of Maui, my life becomes just that much easier as I go to pull everything over and implement in my new projects or my updated projects. So now we're still in a state where Maui isn't exactly the right, it's not ready, right? So if you install Visual Studio 2022, Maui is not a workload that is in existence. You have to install the VS 2022 preview release. You can't, it's just something you have to do. The preview releases in .NET 6, basically, it's tied to the preview release. So again, you have to have that preview build installed. It does, as of right now, still require that you have the Android 31 SDK installed. In the most recent preview, it is still a manual installation that you'll need to do as part of the process setup. The hopes are that that will end up changing at some point in the near future. The workload installation requirement for those of you that haven't installed Maui but want to do so, you choose Maui, and then you also need to make sure that you have UWP desktop development with C++ and .NET desktop development. Those three independent dependencies are needed if you want to be able to do UWP as a target. If you're not going to be targeting desktop with anything you do with Maui, you do not need those three. And then you also need ASP.NET as a feature if you want to do anything with the Blazor desktop or Blazor web view controls, which is going to depend on what you're looking to do. So now, where does this put us? What are the risks to us as a developer that we've now got Visual Studio 2022 and Maui is still out there as a preview release? There's a couple of things that we want to look at. You're still doing manual installations. The manual installations aren't necessarily a huge deal. The only thing that we have to look at is, what are some of the other ramifications? Playing with Maui at the preview time frame has definitely been unique. We're up to preview 11 at this point. Some of the upgrades from one preview to the next is nothing more than changing your NuGet targets. Other times things have been broken or APIs have changed or project structures have changed. So following along at this stage of the game is absolutely something that you're playing with true preview software at this point. So it's something that we really have to understand with where we are. We also need to make sure that we don't accidentally harm our existing environments. I add this note only because the Android SDKs are a little bit weird. There had been a few people that had reported the Android 31 SDK had caused some problems for them. It doesn't appear to be a real big thing, but a bit of paranoia from my perspective is you can install, and you can even see, you'll be able to see here in a second that I have it installed on this machine that I'm using today. You can install the VS 2022 current release right alongside the VS 2022 current release, the current release and preview together. They mostly stay apart. I'm concerned about the dependencies that are outside. Again, I'm extra cautious. I want to make sure that my developer environments are clean. I want to make sure that my team's able to, do their jobs effectively and be able to get things moving forward smoothly and cleanly. So what's the roadmap look like? The .NET Maui team publishes a roadmap out on GitHub as basically a list of upcoming milestones. I've got the link in the lower left-hand corner here of the slide deck. And what they're showing here is Maui Preview 11, which are targeting for December 2021, which Preview 11 is actually out now. If you look at these milestones, it looks like, wow, they got a lot coming out in Preview 11. And then release candidate in Q1 2022. There's just a couple of things that we need to be able to do. The only thing that I see is roadmap looks great. There's also a separate control status screen. And this control status screen shows the status of implementation of each of the individual Xamarin Forms controls. So for example, this is the control status output for the carousel view. A green check mark means it's done. The little timer indicator basically is saying that it's waiting, and then the caution one is basically it's under construction. So as I look at things, this is one of 25 or 30 controls, right, that are out there. We have a lot of these controls that are still where a carousel view, the indicator view works, but is dragging, is scroll animated, items layout, loop, all of these things do not necessarily work in the current preview releases. So I bring this up because what happens is you can migrate your application, but all of a sudden, like your background property doesn't work, or your visible views, or your position change command doesn't actually get fired. So when you're going and doing your testing of, hey, can I take my existing Xamarin Forms app and I move it to Maui? It's not going to work. In the current stage of things, not everything's going to work because not everything is fully implemented. And so with that being said, it's imperative, I believe, absolutely imperative for people to get out and work with Maui and start testing and start getting an understanding, making sure that we understand how we interact with Maui, how we are able to do things. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we absolutely, understand that we can't go to production. So if we summarize this, right, what does this really mean for anybody that's doing the Xamarin Forms development, right? We don't know when it's real. We don't know for sure when this is going to get released to general availability. They're targeting quarter 2, 2022. I fully believe that the team is going to release a product that's going to be great. I also fully believe that the team, when it releases something, is when they're going to release it. They made the very hard decision to pull it from the general availability release of Visual Studio 2022, in November. I believe they've purposely said Q2 2022 to give them the flexibility to deliver and release it at a time that makes the most sense, when it's the most stable. So this means, from a planning perspective, I don't exactly know what we're going to be able to do. So if you're building a new project today, what do? Maui is preview. Maui is not approved for go live license. There's nothing that says you can deploy something to the App Store. Visual Studio 2022 and .NET 6 fully support Xamarin Forms. So you can do Xamarin Forms development. You can get to .NET 6. One of the biggest questions that people had is, well, Xamarin Forms, .NET 5. .NET 5 becomes end of life, in 2022. You can upgrade your projects to .NET 6. You can use VS 2022 tooling. Everything works from a Xamarin Forms perspective. So my preference, this is not a Microsoft recommendation because there isn't any Microsoft recommendation, but as a developer that's been following the preview, as somebody that's been, looking at each of these releases and playing with my environments, what I'm recommending to folks is, if you have an existing project, upgrade it to the latest versions. Get everything, always stay current with the most current releases of Xamarin Forms. Get it to .NET 6 and just continue. Do your development. Pay attention to Maui. Try the upgrade. Give it a shot. See what happens, right? Get feedback to the Maui team. Participate in the GitHub feedback cycle. The team is very open to conversation and making sure that your project and everybody else's project structures are supported and that you're able to make that transition safely yourself. If you're creating a new project, Xamarin Forms, it's our tool. That's the tool that still works today. We do not have a build it on Maui today. There are some people that say, well, I could start the project today because I'm not going live until August. So maybe I stick with Maui. I don't know that that's still a safe recommendation at this stage of the game. It is very possible that would be a workaround, that you would be able to make that work. However, I'm not 100% sure with the grand scheme of things. when are you going to get the features, right? If we have the carousel view, for example, that has all of these properties that aren't yet implemented in the preview release, even if you decided to create your project, you're not necessarily going to be able to take that project and deliver it to a point where you can reasonably say, hey, by August, we'll be ready to go. That's going to be different for everybody else. Maybe you don't need the carousel view in what you're doing. So if you look at the other controls, at the end of the day, this is the developer experience. This is where each and every one of us that develop software for either ourselves or other companies have to take into consideration what is our acceptable level of risk? What is our ability to either A, delay our project if Maui doesn't end up being done at the time that we need it to be done? Or B, if we stay back with Xamarin Forms, are we going to be able to put the time in, put the energy in to upgrade at some point to .NET Maui? The one thing that people ask, and I don't have a solid answer for, is, well, do I have to upgrade to Maui? Right now, the answer to that is, well, obviously no, because it's not ready. But the long-term future, like what happens in .NET 8, right? Because that's the big thing if we really look at where do we want to, what do we want to be concerned with, right? .NET 6 is an LTS version of .NET. Xamarin Forms is part of that, so we're good. Maui is the go forward feature. So assumptions, for what they are, most likely that means that we're going to need to get to .NET Maui as we go to later versions of .NET over the next couple of years. Because there is not a roadmap to create a version 6 of Xamarin Forms. There's not a version 7 of Xamarin Forms. The resources that we're building and developing Xamarin Forms are the primary resources that are building Maui. So we have to do it. So we have to take things and look at them in a light where we can, make our educated guesses, structure our projects in a manner that is going to be beneficial, and try our best to be able to get things moving forward. So with that, I wanted to take some time to show folks around a little bit, show you what a Maui project looks like, what a Xamarin Forms project looks like, just so that we can get a real solid understanding of some of those differences. So as we go and look at these things, it's one of the things that we can do is we can look at the individual project types and what they look like today, and some of the things that I see or other developers have seen that are pitfalls. One of the biggest ones for me is, as we look at our project structures, we have a Xamarin solution today. We have a Xamarin project as well, which is all of our shared items. So this is where we have our models. This is where we have our services, our view models, our views. As we look at the grand scheme of code, as we go from Xamarin to Maui, the models, the services, the view models, for the most part, these items are going to remain essentially unchanged from Xamarin Forms to Maui. The changes are going to be in the views, but at the same time, the structure, the controls themselves are still going to be called the same thing. A grid is still going to be called a grid. A content page is still going to be called a content page. A stack layout is still going to be a stack layout. An image is going to be an image. So the idea is that most of this stuff is going to stay fairly similar. The things that are going to have to go away are going to be the things like the XML namespaces that relate to Xamarin Forms, those kinds of things. So as you saw in the Microsoft examples. So this is something, okay, good enough, right? We then have our individual platform projects today. So as you can see here, Our Android project, we have all of these individual sizes. Like, oh, we need the icon for this size. We need the icon for this size, the icon for this size, the icon for this size. You can see here that that's this little X icon. Well, then I go and look at my iOS, and it's like, oh, well, gosh, I don't even have the same icons. I only have some of the same imagery in place. So this is where we start to see the differences, and you can end up naming things differently. You could see a bunch of different things. But we have basically all of the Android stuff, which is nothing more than assets and the main entry point activity, and then any and all of the properties. So the things like the Android manifest, your assembly info. Same thing for iOS. Now, as we go and look at the Maui implementation, we'll see a slightly different project structure. And what we're going to see is a much more condensed project structure. So at the highest level, our Maui project has a resources folder, and that has app icons, that has a font, fonts, it has images. We have our app XAML, which if you look at your app XAML, it is looking, a lot like what we've seen before, not really seeing any differences. We have, our main page. This is the most basic sample project that we have out there. And then you have your new startup CS. So this is where you can start to see your new app builder configuration. This is one of those areas for me that is a huge, huge win, and something that I think is important for everyone to be able to kind of understand and review over time. Is now we can do all of our startup builds. We can set up our app. We can configure things. So those entry points where we've had to have, the Android project is used for the Android entry point. The iOS project is used for anything that we have to do with iOS. This is the one place where some of the current examples we're using lifecycle events and compiler directives. So, I want to set up if Android on the back button pressed, I want to do this. So again, we keep it all in one place. The advantages that I see with this is you have one way to start your app. You have one set of code to maintain that says, this is how my my Maui app starts. You're no longer having to go through and decide, okay, this is, Android does this, iOS does this, and then you forget about it, you miss something, you miss a configuration step. By centralizing everything, I believe we're going to see a lot of developer efficiency. So what do we have that is platform specific, right? As we go and look at the platform specific stuff, we still have the things that we have to have. So under the Android platform, we still have our Android manifest. We can't get around it, right? We need that Android manifest, but it's still part of the same overall solution. We still have the main activity because we have to do certain things in that main activity, right? We have to tie it to a theme. We have to tie, we have to set if it's the main launcher, that kind of thing. And then we also have the actual main application, which is this is how the startup piece is happening. And we can do anything else that we need to do there. There are then resources, which are the specific things. So you have your Android colors and styles that need to get pulled in. But we limit this to simply assets that are contained within. It's not a separate assembly. It's not a separate compilable item. iOS, we then have the simple stuff here. And again, we have our entitlements, our info plist, our launch screen, our program CS, which is our start point for it. And then we also have the app delegate piece here as we move forward with the setup. The idea from my perspective with all of these is that, we're no longer doing Android images, iOS images, Android fonts, iOS fonts. We're taking all of those things and centralizing them. So we're removing clutter, we're removing duplication, we're doing all of this. With this structure, the biggest things that we can do today from a developer perspective, I think, is architect our projects to where this lift to take and go to this project structure from this project structure is to smartly leverage our existing project structures and to smartly leverage the manner in which we are able to build our applications and set ourselves up so that we have the lowest amount of things to move. So architecture decisions, things such as, moving all of your database activity into a separate assembly, that might be something that helps move less things, right? If you can create a class library that contains all of your data calls, all of your API calls, all of those kinds of things, that might not need to be moved as much as all of your individual XAML files, those kinds of things. And again, it's something that it's all guessing at this point, right? But we can kind of see visually here that if I wanted to take this application and move it over from this structure to the other, I have to kind of take all of these things and mash them into the new place. If I can avoid, for the most part, having to touch these and, file copy, drop them into a new project, and keep them as a class library, for example, that might be able to just be referenced, I'm most likely going to be doing things that are going to limit the amount of effort that I have to spend to make that transition. Obviously, it's a constantly evolving state. The tooling, as you can see here, is still a little bit special. I have, for example, a build issue. I had to do a different Visual Studio update for something that we're working on, and I ended up breaking the build of this project. So this is the sample project. I just can't actually build it and run it right now because I did something on my active development workstation here that introduced a problem with the compilation process and running. So it's still preview. It's still something that's out there. It's going to be great. It is looking better and better. I've taken some applications and started to try to do as much of that transition as I can. But the world is going to be different. You're going to have to change your automation. You're going to change your project structures. You're going to have to change the way that you look at mobile. But the change is good. Keeping your head to the ground, keeping an eye out for what might be next is going to be critical. I want to put back up because I think it's really important. Monitor the roadmap. Monitor the control status. Those pages, these are going to be your real gauges for what comes next. Monitor their blog as well. The Maui team has been very, very good about sharing information. devblogs.microsoft.com and all of the Microsoft teams, it's not just the Maui team, they have been fantastic about sharing what's happening and why it's happening. Sometimes it ends up being maybe a little bit later than what you maybe wanted it to be to get that announcement, but they are really, I think, trying their best to be able to share that information and get it out there. I'm excited. I think that Maui is going to make our lives a lot easier, but I think that we are going to have to continue to evolve as developers in the platform to fully understand what it's going to take to get us to that next stage. So I know that we have a few people that are there in person. I wanted to leave a couple of minutes here for any questions that folks might have. I'll try to answer to the best of my ability, or at minimum can make sure to take a follow-up. Again, we're talking about the future here. I hope that something with this content was beneficial for you. It's always hard talking about something that isn't an absolute, like, here, go do this tomorrow. Go do this when you get to your office on Monday. But I think it's important for everybody, that, especially for those of us that are actively in the Xamarin Form space today, to understand this. So, any questions? I believe there is a phone in the room for anybody that might be there. Doesn't seem like it. All right. Well, and that is not all that uncommon. Well, I really appreciate everyone. COVID situation and conferences. For those of you that are in person, awesome, great to see you. So glad that you guys were able to make it. I'm really bummed that I was not able to make it in person myself, even with the new restrictions. And like I said, if you have questions, if there's things I can answer, I'm always available. Would love to converse with folks. And if you've tried Maui, if you've done something with a real project, I'd love to hear about it as well, because I think it's important that we share those experiences and understand what works, what doesn't work, and how we move that technology forward. Thank you so much.